So I mean, I mean, if John wants to do it, I'm quite happy. But I just thought if he wants to, but he's not here, is he? So I have to, mate.
No.
Oh, that's okay then. So is there anything else that we just read? When's it actually due to start? We've got a date for that now.
So they are briefing, so they've got field workers who are the ones who actually do the interviews. They're briefing them on Monday. I expect it'll start sort of, around weekends on the 23rd of September, I think.
And did we decide on the online thing? I just saw an email.
So
Oh, sorry, I read down and seen it.
Councillor Follows,
Oh, yeah.
portfolio holder for engagement.
Yeah.
Yeah, so they want to
Yeah, I think it's a good idea. I mean, from our experience of the online response from the
yeah,
housing
it gives everyone
standards,
opportunity.
Yeah.
coordinating board, following on from your council meeting last time, we kept green spaces in this committee and gave Kevin Denis licensing. So told him he's still got to have licensing. So I think I think it does sit much better in this committee. I also emailed you all about how I'd like this committee to go, and I think during the look at the forward programme I can perhaps just build on that a bit, because I don't want this just to be a series of small matters that we look at. I want it to be something much more comprehensive. So the minutes, item 1. The minutes have been attached to your agenda. Are you all quite happy that I signed them as a correct record?
Agreed.
Kim, any apologies for absence and substitutions?
We have apologies from Councillor Gray and Councillor Reid. Sorry, apologies.
And there's no substitutes?
No substitutes, no.
Any declarations of interest?
No declarations of interest, no.
No, nothing on the night? No?
No.
It's got that. Any questions by members of the public?
No.
Any questions from members?
No.
In that case, let's go on to our first item. I take it Nora's coming. I can see you down there.
sorry.
Hello, Nora, welcome. So I'll go on to you, the corporate performance report, please. And it's Nora Copping, as I say, who's going to introduce this for us.
Thank you very much, Chair. Good evening, members. The report we will be looking at today represents the data for from the 1st of April to the end of June 2019. That's our first quarter. As I mentioned at the previous meeting, this is a comprehensive report that goes in the same format through the organisation and comes in the same format into all 4 owners committees. However, the members are only asked to look at specifically 2 areas, which is planning and environmental services. So if I could take you to page, and we'll start with planning, to page 26 of the agenda, starting with the performance indicators for planning. As you can see, we have mostly green performance on a majority of the indicators. There's a handful of indicators that underperformed. Those in ambers are not at the moment quite concerning to us. There's one indicator, indicator P3, it is a local indicator that measures all planning appeals allowed out of all planning appeals determined, which has underperformed now for quite a while, and we are quite concerned about this indicator, and there will be a further analysis done by the officers, and that has already started now. So at the next meeting in November, we are hoping to bring a standalone report that will be explaining all the causes that were found to be impacting on this indicator. Unfortunately, we don't have a head of service from planning today who will be able to answer more questions, but I'm happy to take these away and provide you with further feedback if required. Moving on to service plans, again, good performance with 90% of service plans performing on target. We have listed exceptions because we're not bringing the whole list of service plans, so you're not seeing all of the good work that I suppose is being done by the services, so we're just all kind of concentrating on the exceptions. The majority of track actions relate to the implementation of the new IT project that we are working on, and this project is expected to finish at the end of the year. There's also some delays with the projects with regards to systems thinking, and I think there's the implementation of conservation area appraisals as well, no small delay, and we have all the new revised due dates indicated in there as well. We have specified the internal audit actions, but as I mentioned in the narrative, we don't actually analyze performance on internal audit in this committee. That is a subject to audit committee, which will assemble on the 24th of September. So if there are further questions you have for this area, you can tune in on the day and find out what's happening with those recommendations. Something new that we've introduced this quarter is a little bit more granular and in-depth analysis of the complaints. In the past, we had one corporate indicator that was showing the response rate to our complaints, and we felt it wasn't detailed enough to actually allow us adjusting our processes and saying where we actually not performing as well as we would want to. So you can see in here a little bit more in detail information on level 1 and level 2 complaints. And in the first quarter we actually have an area of underperformance for level 1 and level 2 as well. It does represent a small portion of complaints. It's 3 complaints out of 18 that were responded to outside of the target of 95%. And it was due to unplanned absence, so all our complaints that go through the process have to be signed off by the managers, and if we have some sickness or absence in the area, that impacts on our complaints response. Moving on to the next page, page 30. At the moment the service is projecting adverse variance in the forecast. There will be steps taken in the next following quarters to address that. We are just at the first quarter, so there are still no specific area of concern at this time. That will be all for planning. Moving on to environmental services.
Should we just stop there?
Sure.
I'll give you a
Of
little
course,
break,
yeah,
just see if anyone has a
Questions?
question or a statement for Laura on the planning. I think we can all see that we certainly need that extra work on the planning appeals. I'm sorry the head of service isn't here, because we'd like to sort of drill down onto that, but we do know that there's going to be further analysis for next time, so that's good. And the other thing I'd like to push, if I would have pushed had the head of service been here, is local plan part 2, because they are feeding into some of our bad performance, or the lack of it, in planning appeals. Yes, Councillor Martin.
Why is it taking 9 months for the scoping of the project and the new IT system? It's gone the 1st of March now to the 1st of the 12th.
I would need to take the questions away and consult with the team and get any feedback to you. Unfortunately, we don't have any.
Because that's 9 months.
I think that there must be some other priorities that have been kind of taken the place, I suppose, within the team, and the project was just pushed a little bit further. But I wouldn't want to speculate, so I will go back to the officers and come back with an answer for you.
Thank you.
Okay, Councillor Edmonds.
I don't think it's a fault of local government, but there seems to be no quality performance indicator, essentially in terms of the applications, planning applications. It's all about speed and volume. It's just an observation. You ask for observations.
Thank you very much. Sure, that's been noted. We move on then to the environment. Is everyone quite happy? Thank you, Laura.
So if we could move on to page 32 of the agenda. Although we have one red indicator, if you actually look closely at the trends presented by this indicator, you can see that we actually show a great improvement from the first quarter last year. So we had 11.6% reject rate in the first quarter last year, and we, over the course of the year, we moved down to 7.4%. So although we are off target, it was actually a lot of great work done by the team that is reflected in this indicator. There's also another indicator that performed just slightly off target for satisfaction of business with local authority regulation services, which has been impacted by the number of recent enforcement actions. So if we provide some feedback to the businesses, sometimes they don't give us as good score for that with regards to their satisfaction with us. Something that isn't in red or orange, it doesn't stand out really, but it's worth mentioning, is the very final indicator for this area, which is the NI 192 percentage of household waste sent for reuse and recycling, which has increased now to 60.4%, a great success from the team. I think Richard will provide the report. There's a standalone item on the annual air quality status report, so there will be further feedback on that. With regards to service plan actions, again, good performance from the team. We have also an item on public space protection order, which is one of the actions which is off track amongst the service plan actions. There are no specific areas of concern for the internal audit complaints or finance, so I think that's all for Richard.
Thank you very much. Got a bit of quality in there, Councillor Edmonds. I mean, one of the problems is, of course, we have directives, how quickly we're supposed to do things.
I understand only too well.
But it's good to see, and as you say, we are improving in this area. it's a complicated area, but we are improving, which I think is good news. Does anyone have any questions for Nora?
Just
Yeah.
something to point out, which is that for NI 191, you've put percent, or it's been put in by mistake. I think it's just an error. It says 9%.
It should be kilograms,
Yeah.
it's not percentage. That
Oh, I see where you are, yeah.
Because I looked at it and I thought,
Yeah.
what's going
No,
on?
it's,
Yes, it's,
Thank you.
86.5 kilograms.
Yeah.
Not
thank you
percent.
for pointing that out, Councillor Darcy. Apart from we not knowing our kilograms from our percentages, is everyone happy to accept that report? Good, thank you very much, and thank you again, Nora, for taking us through that. If you do have any queries on this, because it is a big document, do take them to the officers and they'll certainly try and talk you through it as best they can, I'm sure.
Thanks.
Thank you very much indeed. So we've got a recommendation that we make any recommendations. You've made one, Councillor Edmonds, on quality. I would certainly like to put something on about the need to get local plan part 2 in action because it will certainly contribute to a better outcome. There's no question we're being penalised because we don't have it in place. Anything else anyone would like to add to that, or can we move on? So on to item 7, which is the overview of Article 4 directions, and Graham, you very kindly said you would come and present this report.
Thank you, Chairman. And Matthew Ellis has joined me as well. Matthew was involved in the pilot Article 4 direction, so maybe there might be some questions that you have that Matthew might be able to help with. But I think the purpose was really just to give you a bit of an overview. I think when you were discussing this and looking at the scope of the committee's work, it was accepted that actually the process of making an Article 4 direction, the decision to make an Article 4 direction actually is one that rests with the Joint Planning Committee because it's obviously directly relating to how you deal with development proposals. But I know that it's something that has generated a lot of interest locally, and I know a lot of you are probably getting a lot of interest as well, and comments and questions perhaps from local residents or town and parish councils. So I think it was timely perhaps to bring something to you just to give you a bit more information. Just starting initially, I mean, Article 4 directions are actions that the council can take to limit the right to carry out development, which might otherwise be what we call permitted development. So, permitted development are those classes of development where you don't have to apply to the council expressly for planning permission to do it. So we know that people can often build small extensions, that sort of thing, and if they were below certain size limits, they don't need to apply for permission from the council to do it. Over the years, the government has kept these under review and has extended the scope of these, and the area that's causing particular concern, I think, among some of the local towns and parishes certainly, and we understand where that concern is coming from, is where the government has made more and more changes of use to residential permitted development, or where they perhaps at least limit what you need to do to get a consent to do it. So you now have a situation where people can change shops and offices and factory premises and agricultural buildings and a whole range of things into residential, and the checks that are there are much less than you would have if you had to apply for planning permission. I think it's fair to say that the reason that's being done, I think it's important to bear in mind the reason that's being done, is the government's broad policy to see a significant boost to housing supply. It's been a key priority of the government, as you know, for some time, and this is just another aspect of that government policy, making it easier to bring some of these premises into use. So the benefits, if you like, in relation to that are that these dwellings that are being created are contributing to meeting local housing needs and are contributing to meeting the overall housing requirements we have as a borough. So our local plan target, to some extent, if we didn't have some of these things coming through permitted development, we might need to be looking for other sites to deliver the housing. So there's two sides to this very much, but I think the concern is where this balance is sitting, what's happening locally and how it's impacting on some of the local areas. And I think it's fair to say that we've had requests over a period of time from all 4 main settlements, so from Farnham, from Cranley, from Hazelrand, from Godalming, about potentially what can we do to try and limit and control some of these changes. I think it's fair to say that the most active requests we have at the moment are from Godalming and from Hazelmere. Before I just talk about those, if I just say that what we dealt with, this is last year, again, against the background of these requests, a report was taken to the Joint Planning Committee, I think it was in May last year, and it was agreed that a pilot Article 4 direction will be placed on the commercial area at Beacon Hill in Hindhead. And the idea of that was to take away, to take away those permitted development rights, which would allow for changes from shops, from things like banks or building societies, and from offices into residential. You'd have to, if you wanted to make that change, you'd have to apply for a full planning application. So that was determined that would be done. The actual Article 4 direction, I think, was finally confirmed, I think, a bit earlier this year. We are still waiting to see what the effect of that will be. I think it's fair to say that some of those who are still very keen that we as a council do more of this sort of thing are saying, well, hang on a minute, you know, how long is it going to take for you really to see much change in Beacon Hill? And we're worried that things are still happening elsewhere, so come on, can't you just get on with doing some more of these sorts of things? But the idea at the time, and I think it was accepted at the time, was that this would be a good opportunity to test it out locally. The requests that we have that are particularly active at the moment are from Hazelmere, who I think would quite like to see an extension of the same provision, so taking away the permitted development rights for changes from shops, from what we call Class A2, so things like banks and building societies, and from offices in the two defined sort of centres of Hazelmere, Town Centre and Way Hill. So they're quite large areas, and they're looking to take away quite a wide range of permitted development rights. So it's kind of like Beacon Hill, but on a bigger scale, I think is what they're looking at. And I think the reason they want that is partly to reflect concerns about the loss of some of those premises, but I think also partly to do with the physical changes. So there's one particular case, I think, in Way Hill, if I understand it correctly, where a change has been carried out through permitted development, and the outcome does not look particularly attractive, where they've changed some commercial premises, and a frustration that, you know, why couldn't we have more control over what was being done to these premises? The Godalming situation is slightly different. It only relates to change of use from office to residential. And this is in reflection of the fact that I think of all the main settlements, Godalming has probably seen more of these sorts of changes come through as permitted development. If you go down Cattershall Lane, places like that, I think Westbrook Mills, I think it is, another one which has got a prior approval for something like 90 dwellings to go into there, which would through the same sort of process. And Godalming are concerned about the loss of office accommodation in Godalming, the impact that's having on the local economy as they see it, and what they're asking for is to have an Article 4 direction placed on a very defined area in the vicinity of Godalming Station. I think the reason for that is they see that as still being essentially a primarily, almost totally commercial area, good location, hasn't yet had the effects of others coming in and changing the uses, so they're quite keen to see that area covered, and they commissioned some consultants to do a bit of work to look at this, both to quantify the changes and the evidence, the information about how Godalming has been affected more than other areas came through this report that was done by Navigus Planning. They've spoken to local agents about the effects, so they feel like they've done quite a lot of work as well, and I think we are still in dialogue with Godalming about that, because I think it's fair to say that there's more of an evidence-based building up there, possibly for further consideration at some stage. The thing to bear in mind is, as I said, if you make an Article 4 direction, it doesn't mean to say that isn't going to have the change isn't going to happen. It means that somebody's got to apply for planning permission. If you were to make an Article 4 direction as a council without real justification, it might be quite difficult then to reject a planning application. So taking the office example, if someone then submits evidence with their planning application to show that there's just no demand for these offices, then an Article 4 direction in one sense is a bit pointless. And frankly, if you then go ahead and refuse the application, there's even compensation liabilities that kick in potentially in those sorts of situations. So the council has to consider it very carefully. That's why we've taken quite a measured approach to this as officers, and think about both the benefits that arise from permitted development, and I know that people don't always see it this way, but you know, they are providing additional homes, versus the potential adverse effects of losing some of this accommodation and the real issue about evidence to justify it. So we're still grappling with some of those issues at the moment. As I said, that's where we are roughly at the moment, Chairman. I don't know whether I'm trying to help with any other general questions, but as I said, ultimately, if we are to go down the road of more Article 4 actions, then this would need further reports to go into the Joint Planning Committee with, in relation to very specific cases.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you. I think one of the issues and one of the reasons it was brought is a general fear for what is happening to our settlements, large and small. And people saw this as one too. And obviously the Beacon Hill one of the big issues there is the lack of parking, because the previous building had no parking, so they turn it into flats and there's still no parking, but people live there. So, I think it's a balance between providing something that is disappearing. So, for example, if you had a permitted development but they added some parking, I think people would be less worried about it. And you're right, there's an automatic change in circumstances that will always happen. I would like to broaden this into a slightly broader one. I'll say what later, but Councillor Edmonds, you indicated.
Aren't there any performance standards associated with permitted development? There are when you extend a house.
If you're extending a dwelling under permitted development, then you have certain limits to the size and so on, where you can and can't put your extension, and obviously it doesn't take away the fact that in terms of the physical construction, it may well still require approval under the building regulations. Where you're changing the use, so just taking an example of a change of use from offices into dwellings, there are certain things that where these provisions don't apply at all. I think they're quite specific, but if it's a site's got an ancient monument on it or things like that, so those rights don't really apply. But assuming those rights generally do apply, then there is a requirement to apply to the council to determine whether prior approval is required for certain specific aspects, and this is where I said that the scope is limited. So if it was a change of use to offices and we said prior approval is required, the things we can look at under that are transport and highway impacts, contamination risks on the site, and flooding risks on the site. So there's a very narrow range of things that you can look at, and it may be that because of some of those things that you say, no, you can't have prior approval because of flood risk or something. But you can't take into account things like the economic impact of the loss of that accommodation. You can't take into account the fact that it's not delivering affordable housing. It's those sorts of things. So the scope is much more limited.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Graham. I just wondered whether or not you could clarify if the area is in a conservation area, has been designated as conservation area, do the same permitted development rights still occur for changing office? Because you said earlier about some particular development looking awful. Does the conservation area have any impact at all?
If it's a change of use to offices, the things that are where it's restricted are in places like, does it form part of an area of military explosive storage area? Is it a listed building or within the curtilage of a listed building, etc.? So there isn't, unlike some other forms of permitted development where physical changes, the change of use itself isn't affected if it's in a conservation area.
No.
So in places like Hazelmere and Wayham, say Hazelmere Town Centre, for example, a lot of that will be still conservation area, but the change of use could still be permitted development, subject to those sort of prior approval things I went through.
And how many actual applications, the Beacon Hill pilot, how many applications have actually come through for change of usage?
Last checking with Beacon Hill, none so far. So that's part of the issue. And I think to be fair, I think there was some comment of, well, actually,